Hello again, and welcome to the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bede Gaming. As always, I'm your host, Steve McAllister. This is the final episode of our weekly conversation on the business of sports betting and gaming for the year 2025. To say it's been a somewhat busy year would be akin to saying the Toronto Blue Jays had a satisfactory season in Major League Baseball. To help us revisit and reflect on the year that's been, and to also look ahead to the next 12 months for the Canadian gambling industry, we welcome back to the show the writer-in-chief of the Gaming News Canada newsletter, Dave Briggs, and the senior gaming correspondent for Covers, Geoff Zochodne. Geoff, I just thought senior gaming correspondent sounded a little bit more upscale.
You know, when I look at the calendar, I see you've been doing this now for coming up on 5 years, just writing about gaming specifically. I'm feeling a little senior, so I'll say it's apt for now.
I'll say the same thing, Geoff. February will mark the 5-year anniversary of what we initially called the Parlay, the weekly newsletter, now Gaming News Canada. And I have a lot more gray hair than I had back in February 2021. So amen to that. And just quickly, Dave Briggs, thank you so much for, we put the newsletter on hiatus for a while there, and you kind of came to our rescue in 2025. So really appreciate everything you've done in resurrecting the newsletter and providing the value that you and Geoff and others in the industry do with your coverage of the industry.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Steve. It's been great, and you do most of the work, so people know. So it really is more about you than it is anything I contribute.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just quickly, we included a thank you in the newsletter this week. As I mentioned, this is the last podcast of the year. We're taking a 2-week break from the newsletter, although I think Dave may sneak out a quickie on the iGaming Ontario November report, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, I just want to thank a few people quickly. Andrea Pierce and the people at Bede Gaming came on board as our presenting sponsor back in October. Really appreciate their support. The Canadian Gaming Association stepped up as a partner in 2025. So we're extremely grateful to Paul Burns and Amanda Brewer, not just for the CGA support, but Paul is always willing to come on this podcast. Geoff, I know he talks to you quite often, and while people don't always agree with what Paul has to say, I think you do have to respect the fact that he's certainly willing to discuss what's going on in the industry, and I don't think he's ever said no to requests from us to speak with him for the newsletter or the podcast. And then, Geoff and Dave they're the ambassadors on this episode for journalists across North America who do such a great job covering this industry. And Geoff, you and Dave and I both, we're not lifetime reporters on the gambling industry, and I think a lot of us in North America came from different places. Dave, you from the horse racing industry. Geoff, you from Queens Park, and there's just so much good work done in covering this beat every day that it certainly helps make our jobs easier. And just too many people to mention, but really thankful to the journalists who helped produce the ideas for this podcast. And then lastly, it's just the people that listen to this podcast and watch, read the newsletter, and Geoff, I'm sure you'll echo that the feedback you get from readers at Covers, that there's a lot of interest in what goes on in this industry, and if what we're writing and producing doesn't have an audience, there's no point in doing this. So like to thank those people as well. Geoff, I'll just give you and Dave a chance just to riff off that if you'd like.
No, absolutely. I think it's a shockingly good journalism that gets done, I think, every day in this industry by a lot of really good people who are very smart. I was speaking, I remember it was in June at the Canadian Gaming Summit, and myself and Tom Nightingale from Canadian Gaming Business were sitting there on the sidelines waiting for another panel to start. And I remember just telling him, I'm like, there's always like a little bit of a friendly competition in the business because you want to be first, you want to do it better. But I told him, and I think he agreed. It was just, it kind of, that competition helps elevate your own coverage. It makes you want to do better. And I feel that, from you guys, obviously, because you do a great job, from Tom, from others, where it's just, you see such good work being done, it makes you want to be better and to make sure that your stuff is the best. And so I have a lot of admiration for you, for others in the industry like Tom. And I just, it's very professional. I think that a very professional job gets done, especially in a year like this, which has been so crazy with the amount of news that we've had.
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, I've learned so much from Geoff, and Geoff obviously has a great background at Queen's Park to dig into some issues that I always go, where does he find this stuff? How does he do it? And that's the experience. That's the experience. So it's very useful to me. And one of the great things, Steve, I think that you've done is you've opened your arms to all of us and made it a little less competitive. So it's kind of the Canadian model versus the U.S. model that we talk about a lot, which is we can all, as long as we're going to credit people as best we can and share it. There's something we can learn from each other. So I don't want to do a kumbaya here or anything, but it's I think it's a better model because I came from a competitive affiliate model into this world, and everything was like, yeah, you got to be first and you got to do this, and you don't mention the competition. And I don't think we're further ahead by doing that. I think we're further ahead by saying, hey, Tom had a great article over here that pointed something out that we didn't. Geoff had a great article. Steve made a great post, So yeah, anyway, again, that is kumbaya, but I think if we share and elevate each other, it makes our game better.
Yeah, and just quickly, it takes me back to my years as a sports writer, and you work like hell to beat the competition on a daily basis, but when you shut your computer and turn it off for the night, you all went out for a beer together, and I think that's good. That's good for everybody, and you're absolutely right, Dave. Everybody brings different perspectives. I think Geoff's piece on prediction markets in Canada a couple of weeks ago, that was a topic that no one's really covered, and Geoff dug into that, and that's something that we hadn't done a lot of. And I think, Dave, your conversation with Dustin Gauker last week that led the newsletter last week, it's just great to get someone, an industry veteran like Dustin, to get his perspective on the Canadian gambling industry and talking about that. And Tom's another guy. I think of Ryan Butler and Mark Keast, who flies under the radar a bit, but Mark's done some really good work for CDC Gaming and Casino.org, and of course our friend Jessica Wellman at SBC, who is almost as prolific as Geoff is on the Twitterverse every day. So anyway, let's get into the iGaming Ontario put out its latest report on Wednesday. Unfortunately, the same morning that Dave we put out the newsletter. So, but I mean, it just I think it caught the three of us off guard a bit. Just November was the largest market numbers yet since the market opened in April 2022, and $9.33 billion in cash wagers in November. That's a record. Handle was up 1% from the previous record of 9.25 billion, and it's 25% ahead of where we were back in November 2024. Dave, before we hit the record button, we talked about sports betting gross gaming revenue. That's $102 million in November, and that's the best month that the sports books have enjoyed since the market opened in April 2022. And I think we just have to mention to our listeners again, that doesn't include the OLG numbers. And I assume that those OLG numbers will tell a similar story. Geoff, maybe start with you. What kind of struck you with these numbers?
Yeah, I mean, the headline numbers struck me as, very impressive. In general, it made me kind of pine for, even more numbers, some operator specific ones, so we could try to discern, where this growth is coming from and get a better idea in that sense. But it just, when I was trying to get a sense and form an opinion on it, it just, I kind of settled on this is just the ongoing maturation of the market. I think operators, we haven't seen a ton of new operators come into the market or anything like that. So I think it just, it suggests that the existing operators are getting better and more knowledgeable with the Ontario customer base. They're figuring out, the customers that they want and giving them the things that they want. And I think that unless we have some other figures that we can go off of, that's kind of all I can really take away from it, because it's just And you see this too. When you hear Flutter and DraftKings and others report, these publicly traded companies report their numbers. They're always, not always, but they do mention from time to time that they're more mature states like your New Jerseys, things like that. They still manage to see growth in those jurisdictions, and it's because you have players in there that they're loyal, they stick around. There's always people who are aging into the market, people who are turning of age to gamble illegally, and so that helps you. And I just think that operators are getting very good at getting a good grasp around their players in any given jurisdiction. And I think until that's sort of my working theory on what's happening here.
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, I was really encouraged by the sports betting numbers. I guess we can look at that a number of different ways, but certainly, the revenue side of that being as high as it was, indicates the operators had a better month, and I guess that means the players didn't have quite as good a month. But a few months back, it was the opposite. It was we had some players having more success than the operators. So, that's just speaks to what Geoff said, a healthy maturing market and those things, because, we've known for a long time that, online casinos are really dominating this sector in Ontario. And so you need a healthy sports betting market as well to make this whole thing function. And poker, poker was not a bad number for its little piece down at the bottom there. And it was healthy.
I wonder, how much of that $102 million were people betting on the Blue Jays to win Game 7 back on November 1st. And I think,
maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to be in those numbers somewhere, Steve, like for sure.
And I think to your point, Geoff, too, I think in terms of operators kind of, finding their rhythm, I think you're right. If you look at advertising now and again, I'm on Instagram kind of every evening, and I would say like 95% of the Instagram ads I see from Ontario operators are casino or oriented now. And we had David Hay from Softabet on last week, and they're very happy with the Toonie Bet business in Ontario in 2025. And we had Shevdar Dimitrov on from Bede, and it's not only people within Bede, but Joseph Hillier at iGaming Ontario was talking about Bede when we had him on the podcast back in October, early November. And then I think the big brands, when you talk to the FanDuels and BetMGMs and DraftKings of the world, that they seem quite pleased with their business in Ontario as well. So it does seem, Geoff, that you're right. Those operators who have their own unique audiences or unique product or whatever, they've all kind of found their a good footing.
Yeah, and I'm always blown away too by the grasp that the operators are able to get over just who is in the market and who they should cater to. I'll give you just one example, and I remember this. It was a few years ago, but I'm reminded of it now because the Ashes is this famous series of cricket tests between England and Australia.
Right.
That happens. I believe it's every 2 years. One's going on right now. I think it's in Australia, and Australia's doing a pretty good job of putting the boots to England at the moment. But I remember my brother went to law school in Australia, so he has a bit of an abiding love for cricket, and he's tried to impart it on me. And so I watch the Ashes every so often. And so I remember I was watching it with him, and you were seeing ads for betting, during this that were kind of catering to the cricket crowd. And it's, I don't think that's going to show up in a huge part of any handle, but I was just kind of impressed that you have these operators that are familiar with the game abroad, bring it to Ontario, knowing that there are plenty of people here who are interested in cricket. A large South Asian community that the game is very popular with, as well as people that want to bet on the Ashes and things like that. So I think that was just a good example of how they're quickly learning who's in the market and how they can pick up their business.
They just off that, and I mentioned that we were going to talk about next year later, but I think what Geoff just said is a great segue. I mean, the World Cup of Soccer coming to North America in 2026, and I'm excited not just as a sports fan, and as a Canadian who's going to have the arguably next to the Olympics the biggest sporting event in the world coming to Canada, but just the opportunity for this legal gambling industry in Ontario to really lean into that tournament. I'm really keen to see what operators do to promote their business around the tournament.
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity, and you mentioned the other thing, which is the Olympics. So we have the Winter Olympics, and we have NHL players participating. So you would think that would be a big draw for Canadian Ontario sports bettors. So we'll see, and it depends on how it's promoted. I believe the last time the women's Canadian team drew a fair bit of action, sports betting wise. Hope that continues. They're a terrific team, as we know. But the men being NHL players, if it goes as it did the last time that happened, it'll be great. So optimistic about that, and that leads just into that's probably a bit of a customer acquisition time for those who haven't really jumped in, who maybe love the Olympics, and then the World Cup is the king sporting event in the entire world. So the fact that it's here has to have some bearing on wagering activity. I would think it's going to be everywhere.
Yeah, if you want to add anything there.
No, I totally agree. I think you're definitely going to see some interesting promotions by operators that are trying to draw your eye to that, because there are people who will, they only bet American football on any given day, but when the World Cup's in town, they're going to think about it. They're going to have, they're going to have a flutter on it just because it's there, it's happening. And I'm also reminded of too, just recently on their latest earnings call, DraftKings, they noted that they're launching, a Spanish language version of their sports book in time for this World Cup, which I thought, it struck me as a really good idea because, there are going, a lot of Spanish speakers in the U.S. A lot of them potentially, I guess, are going to be soccer fans and looking to bet. And so that just seemed, that felt to me like just something that's a very natural and very logical and a smart move to do, because, people are going to be looking to bet on these games, and that, some of them Spanish might be their first language. So just a really, really kind of intuitive kind of tweak to make in time for this big event.
Yeah, I mean, you've got visitors coming, here. So you have a new group of people coming en masse to Ontario to see the games here, to the US, to Mexico. So when they land, if they're inclined to be sports bettors, you're tapping in a whole new group of customers for that period of time. So that's encouraging too.
Yeah, we may see the folks at GeoComply and XPoint and those other businesses be pretty busy during tournament. I mean, the three of us may want to ask for a commission here, but having sports books apps in several different languages is probably a little bit expensive on that. But I would certainly, if I'm an operator, look at a marketing campaign that targets Portuguese soccer fans, Italian soccer fans, the Latin, the Latinos, and I think the Asian soccer fans. I think you can really do some cool stuff from a marketing standpoint in those various languages. Let's jump into the biggest stories of 2025, and just quickly throw out. Obviously, Dave, both you and Geoff covered the Court of Appeal for Ontario ruling on the liquidity issue last month. Geoff, you reminded me in an email before we got into the studio last week about the Bodog Manitoba court case. I think Great Canadian selling off Great Canadian sold off 6 casinos, I believe, in 2025. That was a big story. But Dave, I'll start with you. Like, what story really resonated with you this year?
That was one for sure. The court case, and Geoff did a great job covering it. I mean, that's what informed me is what was happening there by his work, Tom's work, a few others. So that that's what are the implications there? There's some big ones for where could we go, and I got into this a little bit with Dustin Gauker the other last week, and there's potential there. I mean, I think it's going to take a while to unwind, but as we've mentioned a few times, horse racing has had common pool wagering for 20 years, so it can be done. I mean, the thought is there's international laws and different currencies and all these things to deal with, but it's some of that work's already been done. You can adopt some of that work, and how are we going to handle the money? How are we going to handle the rules? So that's encouraging. And of course, poker, especially with DFS as well, took a big hit when we legalized it in Ontario, basically ended for all intents and purposes. And So, to bring those for those people who like to participate in those products, it gives some hope that, hey, there'll be a big, it'd be great to be able to bet in a truly global pool. Wouldn't that be amazing? Anywhere where gambling is illegal. So that's a huge story. The prediction market thing in the United States, once again, I think I said it last time, I'm super blessed to be in Canada where things are a little more simplistic. That might be naive. I'm sure things are coming, eventually somebody's going to test the market here and see what they can, what products they can offer. But just I think a lot of the U.S. writers have talked about this. At the beginning of last year, there was almost no talk of this. And by the end of the year, it was all the talk, So that's a huge just gambling story. They talked about it a lot, Steve, at the global symposium on racing in Arizona. What happens to horse racing if the prediction markets start taking bets on the Derby and Breeders' Cup and all those things? And, there's a huge issue for horse racing on the funding model of how do we do it if we're not doing it pari-mutuel wagering. But so that was a huge one. I mean, it's just, Alberta is out there, so that's one to watch. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's become a big story because everybody's waiting for it. So those are kind of the three that came to my mind. Jeff probably has some better ideas.
No, I think you covered it really well. And also too, your piece about horse racing and the international liquidity. I thought that was very instructive. I got a lot out of that. Just you pointing out this is something that they figured out in a different form, because in horse racing with the pari-mutuel model, you need to have betting. You need to have, that's where the revenue comes from. It doesn't come from against the house where there's a gross gaming margin or anything like that. You need people to bet. And so I thought that was a really good piece. And I was like, okay, well, that's something to go off of. And then I read your piece with Dustin the other day too. And I was like, okay, he's someone who's familiar with that poker world, with the multi-state jurisdiction pools that they've formed. And, to that point with the liquidity case, because I was thinking about this the other day. First of all, looking, would there be an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada? Is that going to happen? And, as of this morning, I was checking the Supreme Court's website where they log the leave to appeal, applications and notifications. I haven't seen one yet for the Ontario liquidity case. I believe it's, in general, I think it was a 30-day window for that to be logged. So I think we might be on the other side of that already. Knock on wood. I don't want to, jinx it and then it comes out this afternoon or something like that. But it looks like as of right now that decision still stands, the majority decision. And so that gives Ontario, a pretty good legal base with which to move forward. And I think moving forward is really where the rubber meets the road on this, because I thought Mitchell Davison, he was on the show a little while ago. He did, he wrote a really good piece explaining the challenges that kind of sit in front of you. And so DFS, of course, is the one that I hear a lot of from people who are, on me, just like, when is it coming back? When are we going to get this? And I thought Mitch did a great job just pointing out, look at what's happened in the US, where the big DFS operators are looking more and more to do more sports betting, right? It's a higher margin product. So you have to make a market that is, attractive enough to them to relaunch those type of products in Canada and in Ontario. And can they do it if they have to hand back 20% of their revenue from DFS to the province? Where is that? Are they going to be able to make the numbers work for them in that way? That's a big thing. Is there a potential for some kind of adjustable tax rate for different products? Can you help them with that? So it's really a question of, how, now that you have this legal decision, how do you put it into practice? And one other thing on that I want to point out is that during the hearings and during the, all the documents that were filed, the Ontario side did note that, yeah, we can go out and strike agreements with jurisdictions, but we could also strike them too with operators potentially, which is a really interesting thing, because if you don't need to jump into a compact with a state or a country, you just need to do it with a business. Some of those businesses might be in Ontario already and operate internationally that can connect to those players abroad. And so that might be a way of less friction in trying to get those agreements done. And so, Ontario left itself, I thought, some wiggle room in how exactly they would put this together. They didn't want to lock themselves into a definitive model. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so I think I spoke enough just about that one part of it. That was obviously a very big news story for me. I thought, of course, Alberta is one you have to keep an eye on. It's been kind of quiet out there, but if you look and you see, they put out a call for board members for their new iGaming corporation. I think they're in the screening process right now of looking at applicants. So it's moving ahead. It's just, they're doing it at their own pace. And, I think that's a very prudent way to go about it as well, because I think, they want to ensure they have everything right the first time, so they're not going back and making adjustments after the fact. And Ontario, we kind of saw that they had to go back and make some tweaks around the advertising part, especially, which is fine. But Ontario was also the first one to go there, so there were some lessons to be learned, and Alberta can benefit from those lessons. And I thought the messaging from the Alberta government, I thought was exceptional. And I feel like I'm just patting everyone on the back this way. I should be more critical. You mentioned at Queen's Park, all we would do is shout at politicians like in scrums. And now, I'm complimenting Minister Nally, because his remarks to the quote unquote mainstream media in Alberta, I thought were really good, a really good messaging of what they were trying to do. And he put it out. He said, we're not trying to create new gamblers. We're trying to get our arms around and offer some protections to existing gamblers who are already doing it with these sites that we don't have any, oversight to. And he was kind of like, he's like, yeah, I'm the Minister for Red Tape Reduction. We're talking about, trying to put some red tape around these guys. Right. But I thought, it was a really good job of communicating what it is they were trying to do, because as we saw in Ontario, when this thing goes online, it can be a very noticeable thing for the public, because there's going to be advertising that people didn't previously see, with new operators coming in, trying to make themselves known. So you do want to kind of brace everyone for the change and explain exactly what it is you're doing. And I thought they did a good job of that. And so, those were two things. There's other stuff too, I'm sure we'll get to, but I'll stop talking for now.
Hey, Dave, I'll maybe get you, because you're the horse racing expert here, just to talk about that, because it was a bit of a crazy year. I mean, we had in the newsletter last week about that there's been a reneging on, I think I'm going to screw up the terminology here, but basically that slots are still going to be allowed to operate at some racetracks in Ontario. I think that was the gist of it. But maybe just talk to us about what the key takeaways from the horse racing industry with regards to the gambling marketplace here this year.
Probably the biggest is now you can bet on horse racing via OLG. So there's two places you can bet on horse racing. So Bet365 and OLG came on board this year just before the King's Plate in August. And, they're still way behind. I'd love to see horse racing on every single platform in this country, but part of it is, they lobbied against that as part of, an open
Right.
market. They lobbied and said, hey, listen, if we allow fixed odds betting on horse racing, the margins are too thin. It'll kill the game. So they still have to figure that out. I mean, there's more experiments in fixed odds wagering. So that's a big topic in the horse racing world. Naira is going to do some stuff in New York and experiment with it. They're big enough to take a shot at it and see what happens to the numbers. But that's always the biggest concern is, the pari-mutuel product supports an entire massive industry of people who, breed, raise, race, train, care for horses and all the ancillary businesses that are connected to that. So we at Ontario Racing talk about, there's 23,000 full-time equivalent jobs in Ontario connected to the horse racing industry, which is much larger than the jobs in Ontario connected directly to online gambling. So that's a thing that we always talk about, which is, be careful about this, because it doesn't, when the governments line up to support the auto industry or the steel industry or the other industries, there's basically government support for almost every industry. So horse racing is no exception. It's not the only one that gets government support through the slots and lease agreements that the OLG has. So the good news is they were going to take the slots out of a couple of racetracks, Kawartha Downs and Hiawatha Horse Park in Sarnia, and they announced last week that those slot halls will stay. So that basically just gives horse racing no longer gets a direct cut from those slots, but they do get lease payments to allow those facilities to be on site. So long, complicated thing. Those are some of the big issues. The other big issue is handle. Handle has suffered in relation to all this online gambling, right? That seemed to be one of the big causes for horse racing to go down. It's a complicated gambling game. It's not very popular as a gambling game. Those things are issues the horse racing industry has struggled with for 50 years or more. But those are the things that we're looking at, is how, handle, the focus on growing horse racing handle has been massive. There's been quite a more attention than I've ever seen on the issue in Canada. So they've realized this is where, all the funding comes from. It's everything. The entire industry is structured on betting on it.
Yeah, and I was just going to say to that point, you look in the U.S., like the jurisdictions that are doing relatively well with horse racing, like Kentucky, a lot of that purse money is being funded from HHR machines. You see the meet at Kentucky Downs is one that always stands out to me, because they run it just for like 2 weeks in the summer, and they throw a ton of money at these turf races, and it's really like kind of a funny track where it's a weird shape, and they have these like European style turf races, and everyone just goes there because the money is so big and it comes from gambling. So there's tying those things together has always made it makes sense for a lot of people in the US. And I'm sort of a neophyte relative to Dave when it comes to writing about horse racing stuff, but I've been trying to do a bit of it this year just because there's been some interesting developments that have happened. You mentioned the fixed odds thing. That's something that I've looked at a lot, because the pari-mutuel model, it has those, it has the takeout that really ensures that everyone's getting that percentage. But then we saw in the US and Louisiana, they passed a fixed odds bill. And what they did with it is that they earmarked in the bill, like, here's the amount of revenue that's going to go, the percentage of revenue that's going to go to purses or to breeding, to try to ensure that if we're going to migrate handle from pari-mutuel to fixed odds, everyone's still going to be made as whole as possible from this. There's still going to be money for you. And so I think those are the conversations that need to be had. In Canada, we haven't really gone there yet. We haven't really decided to. I know Woodbine has a really interesting model now that it's there for operators to pick up and use. And some of those operators too, they offer fixed odds wagering outside of Canada. In the UK especially, there are operators there that have fixed odds. And so you see things, people I know, like they'll send me screenshots of them getting like odds boosts on horse races on like the big races in the UK. And it's like, oh, that's a really interesting thing. And that's a way to get people betting on horse races, is if you put those kind of promotions out there to do it. And so I've always kind of wondered about, if and when that conversation is going to pick up in Canada as a way, because we're now seeing just a growing population of stick and ball bettors that are really accustomed to that fixed odds wagering style. And so it's kind of like one of those things where it's like, it makes sense that they would think more about betting in that way than they would bet the pari-mutuel model that's been around for so long. That is, beloved by a lot of people, I'm sure, but it just, it may not translate exactly or as well as you want to with the new bettors. And so I think there are some interesting ways to approach it if they wanted to go there in Canada. And so I always have an ear out for if that's something that gets talked about more here. Well,
in that, just that, I don't want to go on horse racing too long here to Steve. I'm sure you got
don't want to beat a dead horse, Dave.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the big issues, of course, that we didn't talk about is computer assisted wagering in horse racing. So that is a massive story in the horse racing business. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. It does contribute to handle, so that it's necessary for the tracks and the people in the horse racing industry. But the regular retail bettor struggles with this because it's creating some last second odds fluctuations. So one of the things that was talked about at the Racing Symposium, primarily by Naira and a few of the big people, is can we reduce those last second fluctuations? Can we get to a point where, hey, we're not having a massive change in the odds, we're having a minimal change in the odds? And if we can do that, that sort of puts off the fixed odds conversation a little bit, because the average person who's used to fixed odds doesn't see that much of a swing. It's when people get upset is when, a horse's odds drop huge. And they think, hey, I bet a football game, I get what I bet, but that doesn't work in horse racing. And the education is very tough. So it is the future. I think we have to embrace kind of the UK model where you can choose between what you want. There's predictions, there's fixed odds, there's pari-mutuel. They have all three. But for sure, the 19-year-old sports bettor, the 20-year-old sports bettor doesn't understand horse racing and why the odds change. And so we're going to have some fixed odds in the model, but also in the meantime, can we get those fluctuations to decrease and not be so huge?
When Dave Portnoy is yelling about CAW effect on Twitter, it's getting much more mainstream. So again, we won't make this a horse racing podcast. We could, but
yeah. Well, it's mainstream, and interestingly enough, he bought an Ontario bred thoroughbred this year, so we'll look for that. And he loves gray horses. He bought a gray Ontario bred thoroughbred. So wish him all the success because we'd love to, reach his audience.
Hey, Dave, just quickly with horse racing, I think 25 years ago in the sports media world, this would have been a much bigger story, and that was a closing of Hastings. The Hastings racetrack in Vancouver. And I'm thinking that for the horse racing industry in Canada, that's a little bit like the Montreal Expos leaving town and going to Washington.
Yeah. It tremendously sad because of the great history, right? Time marches on and things are going to change and that part of it. But, they've been doing horse racing at Hastings Park. They're having thoroughbred racing there back into the 1800s. So, what a great history. Yeah, it's a little bit like we talked about in the newsletter. It's a bit of a deal with the devil when you join with casino companies. And the thing that bothers the horse racing community is casinos companies often in the early days of expansion use the safeness of a horse racing track that has existing gambling, is in a community already with gambling, to launch gambling, and then they turn around 10, 15 years later and say, well, we don't want to pay for this horse racing anymore. Casinos are the thing people are here for. Well, you cannibalize their customers too. So it's a complicated issue. But, yes, horse racing needs that to survive because it's probably the world's most expensive gambling sport to put on. There's so many other things that are less expensive to do than race horses. But at its core, it's one of the most exciting forms of gambling that there is. So, what a tremendous shame. So they lost both harness racing and thoroughbred racing at the two tracks that they had them in British Columbia this year. And to the people whose livelihoods depend on that industry, my heart goes out to them because tremendously hardworking people that work, 7 days a week, 14 hours a day to care for horses and race horses. And BC did have a bit of a problem is it's been on an island. It's isolated from other jurisdictions. So drawing other horses into that market to race, to fill fields had been tough. And so that was always going to be an issue of how do we sustain this, but to summarily just basically kill it off is tough.
Ready to accelerate your digital growth? Bede Gaming delivers a market-leading platform with best-in-class products driven by secure, cutting-edge technology. With an open API platform, robust integration suite, and unlimited configurability, you can achieve the ultimate end-to-end customization for your iGaming ambitions. Bede Gaming is your partner for success. Get in touch at bedegaming.com. Hey guys, I apologize for not including this in the prep note, but I think it's a really important topic to cover, and that's the responsible gambling issue. And again, something that was discussed over and over and over again in 2025. And I guess, Geoff, I'll start with you, and I'm maybe just looking like, is there something that regulators and operators need to do a better job of in terms of responsible gambling it's not a simple solution, but what strikes you from what you see about the responsible gambling issue?
Well, in Ontario, of course, we're still waiting on centralized self-exclusion. That is a project that has been promised for some time, and that I think in a market where you have as many operators as Ontario does, is really something you need to, we got to get that done, because if someone is willing to acknowledge that they have a problem and is then saying, that's it for me, and clicks the button, and then a day later they're having second thoughts, and then they can go find another site that they haven't been restricted from, like that's an issue. And there are just, again, so many options. So that strikes me as something still in 2026. If it doesn't launch, in the next couple of weeks, that you got to pay attention to and hope. And I know they're working toward it. And I know it's difficult when you're working with all of these different operators too. Like that presents its own challenges, but that's to me is just a very easy one to knock off there right off the top. Another, I think operators are getting really good at providing their own in-app tools, and informing people about them. Things like, just helping show people the amount of time they're spending on an app or how much they're wagering. And, there are, I can't remember if it's DraftKings or FanDuel, but they have the My Stat Sheet one where it's just like, it gives you a quick breakdown of what it is you've been doing. And when you see those numbers, they can be very sobering. And that could be something that it's just that easy where you can just tell people like, here's how much you've been betting lately. And, then you can process it and be like, oh, maybe that's a bit too much for my budget. Maybe I should dial it back a little bit. So I think like little things like that are interesting. I also think, and it kind of goes back to the CAW conversation that we just had a little bit ago, where I'm always looking at issues of fairness for the bettor, where it's like, I know this doesn't necessarily fall within the RG bucket, but I think that the conversation around CAW reminds me a lot of the conversation around bettor limiting, which today I believe in Massachusetts they're having a meeting on potential regulations there that they want to have when it comes to people having the amount they can bet dialed back by operators for various reasons. And I think that you maybe on its face you're like, that's not really an RG issue, but it kind of is, in that if there are certain people you're allowing to bet however much they want with the inference that they're just going to lose, and so you're not really worried about them, but then you're not allowing people who are winning to bet, or to bet a respectable amount. It's not a great look. It doesn't look good. It doesn't really suggest that there is some fairness there. So I always, I think those are really interesting conversations, those kind of player fairness things, because we all know that gambling, the odds are stacked against you naturally. That's just how it works. But you want to have at least the fairest possible shot you can at trying to win a bet and that sort of thing. And so I think ensuring that and showing people that everything is above board is just really key to ensuring that they have faith in the system, that they're dealing with, honest brokers on all of this. And I think that can go a certain ways toward helping the RG conversation, because, it's an adversarial business by nature. You're betting against the house. They're taking your money when you lose. But if you can be as fair as possible in that business, I think it can help shore up the trust there, and then, help with putting things forward like RG tools.
Yeah, Geoff, I think that RG tool you were referring to earlier, that's the My Spend tool from FanDuel. So just did a quick Google. The Google search remind us of that. Dave, your thoughts on the responsible gambling issue?
Yeah, it's a big thing for me. I write about it all the time, and it's kind of a broken record, which is we need some transparency on what's being spent by regulators, by governments on this issue. It's not super clear. Geoff probably knows better than me because he can sort through all that Queen's Park stuff. But the times I've done it to try and find which department has contributed what to responsible gambling treatment it's not just one place. So it's tough to get a total. I wish iGo or AGCO put out a thing saying, hey, we spend X percent and this is how much money that is, because they're not short on money. We know they're not short on money. And it's always been my advice for Alberta. If what's holding them up are the things that Geoff mentioned, the universal self banning program, or some kind of mechanism to fund RG properly, if that's what's causing a bit of a delay, I'm all for it. Just do it right from the beginning, because it's really hard after. We know that from Ontario. So those are my hopes. Is, listen, I would be great if Ontario or Alberta said we spend more percentage wise on RG than anywhere else in the world. If you can say that, that's great. you know, it's not a huge percentage. We know that. Like they're operating around the, you know, many groups have said you need to just devote 1% to this. So sure, devote 2%. Yes, you want to spend it wisely. You want to make sure there's somebody looking how that's being allocated, all those things. But it's the sustainability for the entire industry, because certain people are going to get in trouble with this, right? We know that. And so if we can keep that number to a minimum number, then great. This industry can go on for a long time, and governments can say, listen, we're dealing with it. We're not ignoring it. So those are my big issues with RG is, you know, do it properly, because otherwise we don't have an industry in 5 or 10 years, because there's going to be a growing problem that's going to end all of this.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, guys, is Ontario. Obviously, healthcare is a very broad, a broad issue. But at the same time, I think the Doug Ford government's done a really poor job, and in fact, really hasn't told a story about the tax revenue that's coming in from this industry, and that can be and how it's being used. And I think that's a bit of a weak point through the whole industry. I just think there's not a there needs to be more cohesive messaging from even, you know, Responsible Gambling Council and GRIO, the operators, AGCO, iGaming Ontario, the government. I think they're all trying to do their part, but I think that there's a lack of a cohesive message there. Geoff, I saw you shaking your head. Maybe I'm not being fair here.
I think you're being fair. I think it's something that can't be talked about enough, right? Where you know, it never hurts to be getting that messaging out there and to be putting it out there and saying, you know, because we have had a year where there has been a lot of pushback for the legalized gambling industry because of some of the scandals we've seen. And so there has been a definite more need to just point out, like, you know, this is why this business, it's good to be regulated, and it's fine that we're here. And part of that is showing people that, you know, this money is going to be bet no matter what. We're getting something and we're putting it toward good causes. And I think it goes, you know, something interesting that we kind of talked about over email. One of the bigger stories happening in Ontario, we just had the announcement this week, was this Niagara plan that the Ontario government is pursuing, where they want to build a Vegas of the North. And I kind of think it's a good time to pursue that sort of project. If you believe the narrative right now that Vegas is under more stress, you know, visitation down, you know, the gambling numbers are still very strong, like the revenue is still there, but we've heard this narrative going on that you know, it's dropped off. And part of that, if you buy into that narrative, if you believe that thesis, and I know some people would push back on it, but we've seen, you know, flight volumes from Canada going down. Part of that thesis is Canadians not willing to go visit the US as much as they once did, because of various comments made by the president and ongoing trade strife, that sort of thing. So if that is going to persist for, you know, some certain time, and you can't just totally forget what's gone on here. Like, people aren't going to forget, and there's going to be hard feelings going forward for perhaps, you know, years, decades, maybe generations, just people remembering what happened here, because it really did sort of wobble the trust between our two countries. And if that's the case, and there's also a cohort of Canadians that want to do casino gambling, and that we're doing it in Las Vegas, it kind of does make a bit of sense to build a Vegas of the North then, where, you know, you can get some of that Vegas style amenity in Ontario. And so that strikes me as sensible. But if you're doing that, and this, I'm finally getting back to the point I was trying to make, then you have to have the messaging around responsible gambling and things very clear, and noting that, you know, this is being done to generate, you know, tax revenue that we're going to put to use in the education system, for healthcare, toward RG programs to ensure that people are wagering safely. Because in Vegas, if you look right now, a ton of revenue is generated not from gambling. You know, you can go down there and not gamble a single cent, and they'll still make their money back on, you know, from having like nice meals, going to shows, going to sporting events. Now, you know, you can have a weekend in Vegas and not gamble at all, and they'll still profit from you in some ways. And so, you know, that is part of, you know, the framing, I think, that they're trying to go with here. And I would say too that, you know, this is something that at a time when the Canadian economy is under a lot of strain because of trade troubles. Having this kind of attraction in your backyard could be helpful for the economy, also for government coffers, and for good causes that you can put this money toward.
Hey guys, that's the perfect segue. I know, Geoff, you're supposed to be on vacation. Dave, you're on a bit of a deadline here. So final question then. Just looking ahead to 2026, Geoff, we just talked about Niagara Falls, and we've talked about a prediction market. We've talked to Alberta. Dave, I'll start with you. Like, what's the story that you're really keen to follow in 2026?
Well, that's a good one. You put that on the list, and I didn't think too hard about it, so this may be a better question for Geoff. But in Ontario specifically, I wonder, does this tail off at some point? Does it sort of hit a plateau? And as we talked about earlier, mature markets like New Jersey have seen growth. But I mean, is it going to continue to be like really steady growth, or will it be a little bit just incremental each month, or plateau a little bit? Because there has to be a saturation point at some point. Maybe we don't see it in 2026 based on what we said about the World Cup and the Olympics and some major events happening on this calendar year. So that's one thing. Obviously Alberta's massive. What happens there? How closely do they follow the Ontario model? Do they put something in that's new, or interesting, or draw from somewhere else that creates a whole new talking point for us in the industry? That's massive. The Las Vegas to the North stuff is great in Niagara Falls. Obviously a lot of that stuff's not going to happen quickly. So is that going to be 2026 or the start of it in 2026? And we see it in 4 years. But surely they're thinking about, hey, we need a major tourist draw here, even, for both our own citizens and internationally. So that's massive. I'm always interested in the horse racing story. Where are we going with horse racing and handle? So that's just my own personal thing. But those are the big ones. The betting scandal stuff that Geoff mentioned, that's a thing to watch. Are there going to be more? Of course, there's going to be more. It's just how many more, and how serious or how big are they going to be? And what's the reaction from politicians, from the market? Then the prediction stuff, where does that go? I mean, do we effectively have another form of sports betting in 50 states in the US, even in places like California and Texas that are staunchly against online gambling? That's fascinating to me. Will there be another province that joins Alberta? That's another one that I'm always looking for. It doesn't seem like any of them are that interested in it still. But I mean, the evidence to the contrary of which system is better is tough, because a regulated system is, generally speaking, a better system if it's constructed properly. And for all those reasons, you're protecting people. So you're doing a better job at consumer protection and rules and guardrails and all those things. So those are quite a few things, but Geoff probably has quite a few better ones.
No, on your last point there, that was one that I was going to put my neck out there and say, I think my prediction is that a province other than Alberta and Ontario will take a step toward a similar market. I kind of feel, I have nothing to base this on. I have no documents. I have no sources, but I just think if you kind of look at the way the winds are blowing, it makes a lot of sense, because you look, Alberta launching, and we don't know when that's going to be. It seems like it's drifted toward the back half of 2026, which is fine. It's still football season if you get there. But I just think the approach of using the carrot more than the stick might prove to be more effective for some of these jurisdictions, and trying to capture as much online gambling revenue that's there for them right now, that they're just not getting all of it through those government-owned sources. And I think, there are a lot of provincial budgets that are being strained right now. I think it makes some sense in some ways for other provinces. So, my bold prediction is we'll hear something at some point about someone either thinking about it or perhaps putting some feelers out there. That's kind of, that was going to be my major one. And I just think, and this was something I flagged in my emails. We saw the decision in Manitoba with Bodog, where the local lottery went in there and they said, these guys are operating illegally. We want, an injunction. We want to, go after them. And they got it because Bodog didn't step into court to defend itself, because I guess when you're offshore, why would you come onshore to contest these kind of things? I don't know. I can't speak for them, but the feeling was that judgment could then be taken and you could take it to all the different provinces and run around, and you have that precedent there. And we're kind of waiting to see what the follow-up is, but that can be a very lengthy and perhaps inefficient process if you have to go after everyone on an operator by operator basis in court and get these decisions made. Perhaps it's easier just to create a system where you can transition in some of the operators irritated and get some of their revenue that way. Ontario has shown that can be effective in reducing the amount of online gambling happening with sources you don't regulate. So that would be my bold prediction. So I'm keeping an ear out. I'm speaking into an existence. Maybe everyone's going to say, Geoff, you're totally off base on this, but I'm shooting my shot on it.
That's why we call them predictions. That's Geoff Zochodne, the senior journalist for Covers. Dave Briggs is the chief writer for the Gaming News Canada, presented by Bede Gaming newsletter. Hey guys, thanks very much for doing this. This was great. It's always a lot of fun. We get you both on. We always go a little bit longer than we expect, but want to wish you both the very happiest of holidays. Thanks again for everything in 2025, and we'll look forward to having this conversation again sometime in the new year.
Thanks. Happy holidays to you both.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dave. Great to be on again. Thanks for having me on all these times. I always love it. I love talking about this industry. Love talking with you too.
Yep, ditto. That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bede Gaming. As always, you can find us on the various podcast apps, and you can also watch our conversation on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Again, we wish all of our friends in the Jewish community a very, very happy Hanukkah and a Merry Christmas to everyone that's getting ready for December 25th. Thanks to all of our loyal listeners once again, and we will see everybody again in 2026.